Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Growing last year's forage was affected by weather conditions. Maize, in particular, is a crop that's especially susceptible to problems during the growing season, though it offers significant advantages. So what benefits can maize provide, and how can we ensure success with this crop for the 2026 growing season? Let's ask the experts, and today we're joined by Ben Lowe, National Forage Manager for Agrii, and Tom Turner, Regional Sales Manager West for KWS. Perhaps a good place to start is with a bit of a recap as to, what happened last year when it comes to growing maize. Ben, could you start us off there? Paint that picture.
I don't think anyone could really anticipate the year that we were handed last year, Tony. Definitely as a contrast to the two seasons before. The two seasons before, 23 and 24, have been incredibly challenging for very different reasons in terms of levels of waterfall. Very wet harvest, very challenging drilling situations as well. Last year, though, totally spun it around for, not everywhere, but large regions of the UK where drought was a significant issue facing our UK maize crops.
And Tom, what did you see last year? What were your thoughts?
Really, we saw a huge amount of forage discrepancy throughout the UK, with parts of the country having fantastic yields like the West that had that beautiful amount of moisture and also those daylight hours, which really kind of helped maize rocket on. But then you could just go a couple of miles up the road and it would be a completely different story. It would look like the Serengeti, and maize would be sitting, no more than a foot or two off the deck and never really produce anything. So last year was incredibly difficult for plenty of growers across the UK.
And I guess the assumption is we're generally talking here about those growing maize for forage use for livestock enterprises, but what about those who are growing for anaerobic digesters? Have they faced the same challenges?
Yes, I mean, we have very regular contact with the AD sector, who, like the forage sector for likes of dairy, were struggling from very similar problems. I mean, we anticipated that places like Kent would be very difficult, but they managed to get moisture quite late in the season, which helped bring on a lot of their forage crops along beautifully, and they managed to get some absolutely bumpy yields. But if you go up into Lincolnshire, again, very different story. And there has been a lot of ADs who have struggled to get the feedstock this year and have been taking standing grass where they can.
Yeah, so clearly some real challenges last year. If I was a grower thinking about this approaching season, where do I start in terms of trying to ensure that I get better results from this crop, better consistency of performance? Ben?
Where do they start? There's multiple elements to consider. For me, from a weather point of view, who knows, Tony, what we're going to receive over the next 12 months. Whatever a normal year is now seems to be a distant memory. But a lot of that is mitigating around resilience of crops, especially with regards to varieties of maize. So variety of selection would be key. But then also backing that up with other elements of the farm and the forage production process on farms, which I know we're here to discuss maize, but just to help offer a little bit of security by giving you those options and increasing that resilience. Resilience is a word that keeps coming up quite often nowadays, isn't it? And it is actually about increasing that resilience of forages throughout a farming system.
So to help answer some of the questions that farmers are asking right now at your farmer meetings and on the phone, you've both pulled together some questions that we're going to answer here. So the first question is, for how many years can I grow maize in the same field? Tom?
I mean, technically, maize can be grown continuously for several years. I mean, we see this on plenty of farms, especially in those who are in less favourable areas. And the thing is, it doesn't suffer from such diseases as you would see in wheat, like take-all, for example. However, I mean, we'd always recommend that you don't do it indefinitely, because you'll see over time yields begin to decline, and continuous maize for many years can result in disease build-up from crop residues such as maize eye spot and also fusarium. But as we stand today, growing continuous maize is still highly economical, and it's a very viable thing to do.
Yeah, very good. Next question, Tom, perhaps you be in a good place to answer this as well, is, well, what is the best seed rate for drilling maize?
I mean, there are a good few factors which influence this answer. Firstly, if we're talking about sites, a sheltered site, typically you could go for a high seed rate, 100,000, 110,000 seeds a hectare. If it's an exposed site where we're likely to get prevailing winds, where you'd want to protect that crop a little more, you could knock the seed rate back down to 90, 95,000 to help build that stem stiffness to, protect it across the growing season. Secondly, you also, if you're drilling a little bit later in the season, from mid-May onwards, reducing seed will bring forward the maturity a little bit to help reduce the risk of crops holding on a bit too long late in the season. Again, coming back to the point that Ben was making earlier about protecting soil, if you go late into the season, you're then getting into problems with reducing soil health and damaging the soil, not giving yourself adequate time to get the crop off and get a cover in over winter season. Also, in low rainfall areas and on drought-prone soils, reducing seed rate allows for more moisture per plant and reduces the risk of drought stress in that crop.
Another good question here is around the use of plastic film, particularly in marginal areas, to help get that maize crop going. What are your thoughts, Ben?
Traditionally, I would say it has been. Definitely with the varieties that I first joined the seed industry with, probably 15 years ago now, it was the only way that we could grow the most earliest of those varieties. Even then, Tony, with the aid of the film, of course, to increase those heat units within soil profiles early doors. But again, doing a lot of work with growers, especially in more marginal regions that haven't really thought about maize being on the radar for them over the last few years, has really shown us that, again, coming back to the benefit of modern day genetics, the advances in maturity, but the performance in particular of those varieties at that earlier sector, maize can be reliably grown now in some of the most marginal regions without the use of film.
Okay, let's talk about early maturing varieties, which has been a big topic of conversation, hasn't it? And Ben, we talked about this last year in the Tramlines episode. Is there a trade-off with yield when we start to grow these early maturing varieties? Ben?
Yeah, this is quite a hot topic of conversation for me, Tony, and especially after the last 2 years. Like I say, well, not last year, the 2 years before that. Very difficult maize harvest, very difficult growing conditions, and a lot of farmers and UK growers reaching for those earlier varieties so that they can ensure that earlier harvest. But of course, that first question is, this all makes sense, but how much yield am I going to lose? Now, I would admit that yes, there will be some level of yield penalty, but actually in vast majority of the cases, probably not as much as first perceived. And the reason for that is, when we look at official data, we look at the situations and the trial data that's been harvested within the UK to give growers their selection. And a lot of these early and the ultra early varieties in particular, within the trials, they're harvested at around about 40% dry matter. Well, if we think that, maize being harvested, we're going to be gaining around about 2% dry matter per week leading up to harvest, those varieties within those data sets, giving that information for growers to make the decisions from, they've been out in the field for perhaps 3 to 4 weeks longer than commercially would be. So that's actually where quite a lot of yield is lost. Now, a lot of work is being done by, in particular, the BSPB at looking at different ways of us, harvesting those trials to give more relative data. But actually, more and more growers are having to take a bit of leap of faith, go with these ultra early varieties, and then they phone me and say at harvest time, you're right. Yes, all right, we might have lost perhaps 2 to 3% yield, but 18, 19, 20 tons to the acre is very commonplace, even for the most very, very early varieties.
Whether you're growing maize under degradable film for AD feedstock, silage for livestock, or maize for grain, Agrii can supply the market-leading technical advice and varieties you need. Click the link in the bio to download the 2026 Agrii Maize Guide. And if we switch the focus for a minute or two and think about growing maize for combining, what type of varieties work best in that scenario, in that system?
Really, you're thinking about a variety that has got to stand for a fair bit longer, several weeks longer than a forage crop would. So thinking about standing power is going to be a big thing. And the focus is very much on high grain to stover ratio and a plant that dries down the cob quickly while the stalk stays strong to prevent any brackling. Getting a little bit technical, cob dry down does not always mirror the forage maturity, which is very important to remember. So when we're looking at it, we need to take quite a balanced view on grain yield and grain moisture content, providing good yields, aiding the ease of combining and subsequent drying needs.
Now, our next question we sort of covered last year in last year's podcast, but I wonder what your thoughts are this time around. And the question is, what's best? Undersowing maize or establishing a catch crop after harvest? What are your thoughts?
I mean, really, it depends on what your sort of goals are at the end of the day. If you're in a position where you can get your crop off early enough in September to get a catch crop behind it to give that extra bite in spring, great. But they can be risky if maize harvest is delayed. So really, a lot of this has got to be underpinned by good maize practice, making sure that your site selection is driving your maturity selection, and then you're getting the good agronomy to underpin your maize harvest getting off at the right time.
So you've talked about growing early maturing varieties. Is there a benefit of growing those even in the most favourable regions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing some incredible genetic gains from these early varieties, which Ben tapped on to earlier, meaning that we're seeing less and less of a yield discrepancy. And growing an early maturing variety in a favourable region, we allow an excellent early entry into a first wheat, which can typically deliver higher yields, improve the chances of getting a September harvest rather than going into October in the mud. And look, a big thing is reducing the risk of soil compaction and runoff, and potential penalties that potentially may come in the future from eutrophication, loss of nitrates and phosphates into watercourses. And really, as we're losing more and more actives, or the potential to lose more and more actives, having earlier varieties in favourable regions as part of a break crop adds an excellent cultural control for helping manage black grass pressures.
Yeah, and not forgetting it's not just a valuable crop for different farmers for different reasons, but I think it's a really exciting crop to see growing in the fields as well. So thinking about that excitement, there's a question here where farmers are saying, well, what's the next big variety? What should they be looking out for that's new for this year? Is there anything new, Tom?
Oh, well, within Agrii's portfolio, we've certainly got KWS Leto, which is not brand new for this year, but it's a very strong ultra early option, which has had fantastic uptake from the growers who've taken it on board, and they've seen some great success with it. Also, KWS Pasco, again, it's not a new variety, but it is a variety which does well everywhere. It's a very strong, stable variety with great standing power. And I think really Ben would probably echo that. He's had very good success with both of those varieties so far.
So Tom, let's ask Ben. He's here right now. Ben, are you finding that some of these varieties hold great promise for the future for our growers?
Again, keeping our eye always on the horizon, Tony, in terms of what's coming forward. What I would say is the next generation of KWS material, which myself and KWS are talking about, the potential advances of performance from that generation of varieties in particular, they look incredible. And on behalf of UK growers and what they could add to their systems, I'm very excited to see them come to fruition over the next couple of years.
And I'm sure a question that farmers would ask you at any one of your maize variety meetings and maize meetings you have at this time of the year is, well, why do these varieties vary in price? Why is there that difference? So you're both here. There you are. The floor is yours, so to speak.
Look, for breeders such as KWS, we have a dedicated breeding program which is specifically designed for Northern Europe. And Northern Europe, just to not bore with details, but we are a maritime climate. We're cold. We need to be breeding maize material which can reach maturity successfully within the UK, which means we need to invest an awful lot into R&D. And it's important that we remember that really it's a tropical plant that's growing in these conditions, and it incurs a significant amount of cost to get these through these programs. And as with all crops, some produce higher seed yields, for example. Hence, we get a natural variation in production costs. And of course, maize is a hybrid, which means it's intensive and it's time consuming to process and deliver the varieties needed.
Ben, I can see you nodding there. What are you thinking?
But I would agree with Tom in terms of what he says. And my advice to a grower whenever they're saying, why is this variety more than that one? 9 times out of 10, the earlier that you go with a variety, especially with regards to maturity, the more expensive they'll come.
And I've got a final question here. It says, we moved to ultra early varieties after the wet harvest in 2023 and 2024. Should we look at later varieties again now?
No.
That was easy. Tom, is yours a yes or a no?
No. I think Ben would probably agree with this. It can be tempting to chase those higher yields with the weather memory that we've got, but we can't forget that actually, years like 23 and 24 with wet harvests, growers are going to get caught out if they simply base their decisions on last year. Look, simply underpin this with best practice advice. Follow the principles of selecting maturity based on the most limiting factor that you've got, which is your site location.
It's been so interesting listening to you both with all of your expertise and experience. But of course, we're running out of time, as is always the case here on Tramlines. So I wondered if I could ask each of you to share what would be your top tips to growers who are listening today that can help them have a successful 2026 season when it comes to growing maize. Ben?
First of all, be looking at your variety selection for this next year, Tony, just maximising the overall potential, and not only from yield. Yes, I know yield is key. We've said it's a very evocative crop. We all like to see big crops of maize, but balancing that with quality as well. Because what I would say is, even in those regions whereby, yes, yield has definitely been impacted for, the drought conditions that we've talked this last 12 months, for the quality that has been produced of a lower yield, it's actually feeding very, very well. And growers are already starting to switch on to, if we're just chasing yield, but actually, yield is governed to us by Mother Nature, but we can also maximize quality at whatever yield we get in any given year for whatever given reason. We know we are ensuring the maximum quality potential from our forage produced by our maize year in, year out.
Yeah. Very, very, very helpful indeed, Ben. Tom, what would be your top tips? What would you urge growers to really consider carefully right now to have the chances of a successful outcome this year?
Honestly, I've said it 3 times already this evening, but site selection. Make sure that you're paying attention to detail, listening to your agronomist, making sure that you're getting the right maturity on that site to make sure that you're getting the best chance of getting that crop off at the right time at its peak performance, so it's going to feed out well, and also not leaving it to sit too long at the time of forage. We don't want it to be going too dry.
Thank you, Ben and Tom, for such topical advice at this time of year for maize growers. Do stay tuned here on Tramlines. Recent episodes live from events and discussions on crop resilience, varieties, nutrition, soil health, and lots more. If you have any questions for our experts that you'd like answered, email them in to info@agrii.co.uk. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. See you next time.